following video is brought to you by the Boston Sports Entertainment Network. Please consider liking and subscribing for more Boston sports content.
I got the Boston Celtics going to the finals. I got them winning without.
It's time to represent your city. Put your hands up. Colin, you know we do it for Boston. Hey, ain't nobody gonna like Boston. Yeah, hey. Ain't nobody do it like Boston. Where the legends get made, where the banners get raised, bright lights, big stage. Boston. All the fire we bring in a city full of rings, it's a beautiful thing out in Boston. And you ain't hard like that, you don't put it on the line with your squad like that. That's right, Boston. All we do is win like cigars in the gym, and we at it again. I say, Beantown, what's up? What's up? 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 Feel the energy shift, now we jumping at the gym. Represent, showing out how we ball above the rim. Larry Legend, 86, to the truth in 08. Cement your name with the all-time greats. Still banner 18 in the Raptors. Celtic green, only green that matters. It's about that time. Ain't another city that's louder than mine. Always gonna shine with the game on the line. What you think was gonna happen, man? That's how we do it in Boston. Ain't nobody gonna like Boston. Yeah. Ain't nobody do it like Boston.
All right. Welcome into this episode of the Dynasty Proud podcast brought to you by BSEN. I'm Ryan at 19_loading here as always, recording on this Friday, March 21st, 2025, after the Boston Celtics have reportedly been sold to a new ownership group. And we'll get into that and a whole lot of other things as well. But first, I need to introduce our guest. It's Noa Dalzell. She covers the Celtics for CLNS Media, in addition to covering the WNBA for SB Nation. And she's got her own podcast, You Got Boston. So, Noa, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Happy to be on.
So as I mentioned, obviously the Celtics have just recently been sold. That's the big story going on right now. We planned this podcast before we got that major news. So for selfish reasons, timing couldn't really be any better. But considering the part of the season we're in right now, this news is much more exciting than, the recent games against the Nets and the game tonight against the Jazz. That's not to say I don't want to watch the game tonight, because I do. But this is a lot bigger than that. So first and foremost, you're kind of our boots on the ground here. What can you tell us about this sale of the team now that it's been a little bit more than 24 hours after the news broke?
Yeah, I think the main thing is that everything that this new owner, Bill Chisholm, is saying is the right thing. Like, clearly he has the right PR training. Clearly he's the story that he's selling of, a lifelong fan who was super into the team. I watched his interview with Chris Forsberg on NBC yesterday. It's very clear that he's super giddy about this. And I think he's, like I said, people just want a continuation of what was the previous ownership group. And Wyc is singing his praises. And obviously Wic's going to do that because he selected his bid. I think there's an element of uncertainty right now around how he's going to run this team. And we know that Wyc is going to be staying on as a governor for the next 3 years. But also sometimes it's easy to signal that and say that at the beginning. And we saw with like Mark Cuban, right? That didn't actually really happen. And so I'll just say right now, I think everything sounds okay, like as far as what you would hope to hear. I know that there were groups that people were really concerned about, like, this is not Fenway Sports Group, this is not John Henry. Like, there were definitely scenarios where people would have just been immediately unhappy. But the reality is that even if Wyc Grousbeck had stayed on as the primary owner, like, they were going to be in a really difficult situation over these next few years regardless. And so this guy's going to probably have to make some unpopular decisions regardless, because that's kind of the position that he's coming in and taking over. But the reality is, if he's willing to defer to Brad Stevens and not cheap out, and I think he's walking into a pretty good situation, but with difficult decisions looming for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, the team was going to have to make a lot of those decisions regardless of whether they were selling or not. I mean, that luxury tax bill is getting really inflated. And I know Wyc mentioned this morning, he basically, I think this was on WEI, he said, like, he predicts that no team is really ever going to be in the second apron for 2 years in a row. I think that was what he said. And it's just a hard spot. And like he said, it's more about the basketball penalties than it is about the financial implications. I mean, the luxury tax is one thing, but that's just money. And going back to, the the new owner, Bill Chisholm, you kind of brought up that he's kind of a local guy, apparently grew up in Georgetown, Mass. Do you think it matters where the owner is from? Like, do you think it matters that he was a Celtics fan or anything like that?
I think it's good that he has roots to the area because in general, like if you are somebody who's just buying stuff and buying teams and, are just trying to make a profit, like it's probably not in the fans' best interest. But I also don't know, and this is not to say like he's not being genuine, but I don't, the story of like the encyclopedic knowledge and he grew up going to games and things. Like there's a certain element of like maybe he was a casual fan, maybe he was a diehard fan. Like I don't know yet. All I do know is that there's a PR handbook that he's following pretty closely right now. And he's doing it well and he comes off authentic. But I'm not going to say like because he has some roots in the area, like he's going to be a great owner, right? Because also sometimes the owner that's the fan owner that's really passionate inserts themselves a little bit too much into it. I think in an ideal world, this is somebody that kind of gives Brad Stevens the keys and is a little bit more of a backseat owner than somebody who comes in and is like a Matt Ishbia type who clearly is willing to spend, but also is like kind of centering himself in decision making. And this guy is not an experienced basketball executive, and most NBA owners aren't, right? And so in an ideal world, they're not becoming the decision maker and centering themselves and becoming like a household figure, but they're just kind of the ceremonial person. And I think there's an advantage in the fact that he's intrinsically motivated by the team winning, but you would think you would become that regardless, even if you weren't like a lifelong fan. But clearly, sometimes you see that that's not the case. And there were definitely some bids out there that weren't necessarily going to be a lifelong fan. So there is some value there.
True. And so Chisholm is, for those who might not have been caught up on this so far, he's the co-founder and director of a company called Symphony Technology Group, which is a private equity firm based out in California. And his firm has been involved in acquiring and overhauling tech companies. And I mean, I don't know if anybody cares about the specifics of what he does, but I like the business side of sports probably not as much as I do the actual games, but pretty close. And so his group that's coming in includes Rob Hale, who was an existing stakeholder in the team, and an investment firm called Sixth Street, which has investments in the San Francisco Giants, the San Antonio Spurs, Real Madrid, FC Barcelona, just to name a few. And if you get some time, I highly recommend checking out their website because this is a massive, massive firm. They've got investments in agriculture, consumer products, energy, all kinds of other internet tower infrastructure. Like they're all over the place. But the short version of it is that this company has loads of capital, but they're also going to be profit oriented, right? So the Celtics organization, I think we've heard this sort of maybe not in so many words, but they say they get paid in banners. Like they're not necessarily with the high payroll right now. They're not necessarily as profitable as they probably would like to be for somebody who's paying this amount of money coming in. So does that concern you at all? Do you think that there is concern around the team about whether they're going to sell off pieces, trade players, raise prices? What do you expect?
Well, I think they're going to trade players because this team is set to be the most expensive team in NBA history next year. And so regardless of whether this person wants to prioritize winning or whatever, like there's the financial side. And then there's also the reality that like being in the luxury tax, being a second apron team also comes with like a lot of really stiff penalties. Like the NBA is really disincentivizing teams from being in the luxury tax and being second apron teams. And right now I think it's the Wolves and the Phoenix Suns and the Celtics are the three teams that are in the second apron. Obviously one is in a better position than the other two, just from a contention standpoint. But that's not, I think long-term, they want to get below that. And so people are going to freak out the first person he dumps, like whether that's Kristaps or Drew or Jalen or whoever, I don't know who's going to be, but people are going to freak out and there's going to be a wave of like, is this guy just kind of selling off the pieces, like the private equity way, but for a sports team. And I think the reality is that that's not going to be enough to signal like what his long-term governance philosophy is going to be. It's going to take a little bit longer than that. But again, that is kind of what private equity is. You hope that anybody who takes this on is taking this more as a passion project than as a profit maximizer. And I'm not a business person, but I will say, I think for the reasons you said, and they don't own the arena, like there are simpler things you could buy and invest in that would come with less baggage than a pro sports team. Even though for Wick, he bought this team for $200 million and he's selling it for $7 billion. So it certainly was a profitable thing. But yeah, I think this is going to take time to see exactly where, how things shape up here. And it's going to take time to get a sense of like who this person is. And I think the biggest thing that we're going to see is if Brad Stevens is here in the long term, that means that I think he still sees that there's a pathway to success. And if Brad Stevens leaves in 2 years, I'd probably take that as a bad sign that he's not seeing eye to eye with the new ownership, and he doesn't really think that he can succeed there. So that's like one measurable way that I think fans are going to be able to see how this person is behind closed doors and how willing he is to spend and how invested he is in the team winning versus just maximizing profits. I think there's a lot of discussions around buying an arena or building their own arena. And like, I think on a personal level, like Boston has an amazing arena that's in downtown with a great vibrant fan base. And you just never know when you move an arena, like what that new fan base is going to look like. You see that with Golden State, where Chase Center is nothing like what Oracle Arena was in Oakland. And so that's a scary proposition too. Like, I think the average fan doesn't care who owns the building. They just want to go to games and they want to be able to take the tea there. And so I'm curious to see what he'll say about building an arena in the coming days as well. Wick seemed to suggest on his appearance on EEI, I believe this morning, that he doesn't think that there's going to be multiple arenas in Boston. Like, the city's not big enough for multiple arenas, but you never know. He might look at it from a profit standpoint and say it doesn't make sense that we don't own our own stuff. So right now it's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of press releases and saying the right thing and kind of smiling and coming off authentic. And I think he's done a good job at all that. So I don't mean to be too cryptic. I don't mean to be too cynical, but I think right now it's like, how well are you following the handbook? And he's done good.
And like you said, we're hearing a lot from Wick right now, but at the end of the day, he's not the one that's going to be making a lot of these decisions. He's not the one with the money, is what I mean. But he'll be obviously involved, but at the end of the day, is someone else going to be making the call above his head? That's entirely possible. Going back to the private equity thing too, we don't have to get too into the weeds on this, but it's becoming kind of a trend, particularly in the NBA in sports. There are there's a list of teams that have a couple other firms invested in them. That's Golden State, Philly, Sacramento, Utah, Atlanta, and Minnesota. You can debate whether that's good or bad, but it does add the element of access to capital that a family of investors like the Grosbecks just wouldn't have. And the other thing is, on the flip side, if you look at the teams on that list, there's some mixed results. I mean, Golden State traded Klay Thompson, Minnesota traded Karl Anthony Towns, Atlanta traded DeAndre Hunter, Sacramento traded De'Aaron Fox, excuse me. Philadelphia's a mess for their own reasons, but that has nothing to do with that really. But I just wonder if there's any cause for concern that somebody who's coming in as an investor, like more the Sixth Street group, more than maybe even Chisholm, might be a little bit colder when it comes to getting rid of players. But as you said, teams don't get bought and sold every day. This is a long-term investment. So it's going to be more about the next 20, 30 years than it is about the next 2 or 3. And regarding the new stadium thing, like you said, apparently they didn't rule out building a new stadium, but they did indicate that they value the relationship with the Jacobs family too much to split from them. And if they did build another, the teams would probably play in the same stadium or in the same arena. So I think that part of it would be interesting too, trying to coordinate with a team in another sport and another ownership group that's outside of their control. I'm curious how a new ownership group is going to want to handle that. The other thing that I thought was kind of interesting in the sale was the whole aspect of the Steve Paliuca part of this, where he put out his own statement, and Wick said in a letter to Celtics investors that in the end, Bill Chisholm and the group that he put together came in with the superior final bid, and the reporting is that was the higher bid than the Paliuca group was able to put in. But I just thought that the Paliuca thing was a little bit strange. Did you get any sense from any of that there's anything going on behind the scenes that maybe we don't know about?
No, I don't think so. I think the reality is that, he was the minority owner and wanted to stay on. And if you think about this, like, this kind of sucks for him because he had no interest in stepping away from the team. So I thought that his statement it sent a clear message. He said, luxury tax be damned. That line really stood out to me of like, obviously that's what the fans want to hear right now. The fans don't care about luxury taxes. And also he's saying like that's the way I would govern this team. Whereas in reality, like I said, I think regardless of who the next owner would be, whether it's Wick, whether it's Pagliuca, whether it's Bill, or whether it's somebody else, like they were going to offload some of the salary. Like this team was going to be historically expensive. Maybe if they win the championship this year, then you have a case to like do one more year of this, just because now you're talking about like this team's won back-to-back titles and could potentially win 3 in a row, and that's a very exciting prospect. But I think if they lose this year, then it's a no-brainer, regardless of who the owner was going to be. Something big was going to happen. But Steve said all the right things in that letter, and I think that the guaranteed financing is one thing that stuck out, where he's basically saying like this private equity money is not guaranteed financing, and you know, I don't know how much the average fan cares or thinks about that, but he was trying to make clear like that there were advantages to his bid, that it's obviously there's a level of continuity, it's fans from the area. You know, Pagliuca lives here. This guy does not live here, even though if he has ties to the area and he's going to buy a house in Boston, like he lives in California, right? And so most people would have been happier. I think the average person at home and probably the average person in the Celtics organization would have been happier if Steve Pagliuca was selected, because everybody likes him. He's already been around. Like there's a smaller chance that drastic change would come. But at the same time, we don't know what he is like as the number one guy, and like what kind of decisions he would have made, who else would have brought into the fold, because it's like going to be a big ownership group. So I would have picked it. Like I think that would have been a safer bet, but it's still, all of this is completely uncertain. Like I said, I'll keep saying it, but I think if Wick had stayed on, he was going to make some really unpopular decisions anytime soon. He kind of is leaving like at the perfect time. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Bob Myers leaving Golden State, where he didn't have to do anything with Clay. He didn't have to do anything with Draymond. He didn't have to worry about like the next, you know, they were in a tougher spot here. They were going to have to give up some guys that have been critical to their title runs. He left, you know, unscathed, never really had to make any tough decisions. And now he's in media. And I think Wick's going to leave this town forever a hero, forever for, you know, delivering this championship. He's not going to have to be making unpopular decisions. And we'll see. I mean, unless, you know, I don't know about this governorship. Maybe he stays on and does make an unpopular decision as this is the kind of the face. But I'm a little skeptical that he's going to be like as involved as he currently says, just because history shows that it doesn't usually happen.
And that's fair. And obviously it's only been it's only been a day really since we got the news. So there'll be a lot more coming out over the next weeks, months, and years about this new ownership group. So I'm obviously curious to see how all that plays out. But for now, Celtics do have a game tonight playing the Utah Jazz. Their record would tell you they're one of the worst teams, if not the worst team in the league. But they're missing Lauri Markkanen and John Collins. It is a reunion for Jaden Springer and Svi Mikhailuk with some old teammates in Boston, so that's pretty cool. I'll just say this personally. The Jazz, I really don't think are as bad as their record says they are. Walker Kessler, is an excellent player. Keontae George has like legitimate explosive scoring ability, and I think is honestly a little underrated as a passer. What are you expecting tonight in the game against the Jazz? And I guess overall with this road trip coming up, what are you expecting for the team going forward?
Yeah, so the Jazz are in an epic season of tanking right now that honestly, I think the NBA needs to like examine tanking across the league, because it's making March basketball kind of ridiculous for like a third of the teams that are all in a competition of free fall. So injury report for Utah tonight: no John Collins, no Lauri Markkanen. Like, I mean, maybe some of these are legit injuries or legit reasons. Lauri Markkanen is with personal reasons, but this has been like every game now where like half their roster is listed as out. So they're gonna be very short-handed. That being said, like players don't tank, teams tank, right? And we've seen many, many instances in recent weeks and always of teams playing really hard and maybe even inadvertently winning because their players are trying to win. So I'm sure Utah will be competitive, but biggest things that I'm watching out for tonight, and honestly for this road trip, because this road trip is filled with teams that are racing towards the bottom, with a few exceptions, but it's not the most competitive trip. But the biggest thing that I'm watching out for is Jaylen Brown's health. He's not playing tonight. He's out with this knee injury for the third game in 4 nights, and the one game that he played, he left early. But this has been bothering him for like 5 or 6 weeks now, since before the All-Star break. I don't need to explain why he's critical to this team, but we all know that he's critical to this team and was obviously enormously critical to last year's championship run. And I don't think he needs to recreate that run for the Celtics to win the title, because think other guys are going to play better. You don't need him to be at his like absolute best, but you're going to need him to be good. And right now I am concerned about a knee injury that's lingered for that long and has clearly impacted his explosiveness. He's not finishing at the rim at the same clip that he was earlier in even the season and in previous years. And you can tell that physically that he's in pain. Like when he had a dunk a couple of games ago where he literally was in pain as he was, taking off, and when he landed, he was bracing his fall. So I think he'll play at some point on this trip. And the biggest thing that I'm curious about is like how he looks when he is playing. And if he seems like he's at full strength, obviously you want to see Kristaps Porzingis continue to get back in rhythm. Like he's looked really good in his 2 games back. I always say he has like the best. Nobody knows how to return from extended absences like Porzingis does. But even still, like he's going to have to get back to like playoff shape, playoff form, his rhythm and everything. So that's something else to watch out for. And then Drew Holiday, has had a little bit of an inefficient season. He's not shooting the way that he was earlier in his Celtics tenure. But he's been more aggressive offensively as of late. And I really liked how he performed in the back-to-back last weekend in Miami and New York, between the 25-point outing versus Miami, where he was really kind of exploiting the fact that Tyler Hero was guarding him, and then has 12 assists the following night. So a reminder that he's like not a role player, right? He's a guy that's a 2-time All-Star that can do a lot more than he's been asked to do. So those 3 guys, I think, are my biggest X factors for this team. Everybody else, I feel pretty confident that I know what I'm going to get in the playoffs. Like, obviously, there's variant shootings and things like that, but Jalen, just because of his injury thing, and then Drew has just been in a little bit of a slump, and then KP just because he's so in and out of the lineup. Like, can he really get some continuity going? Because before he got sick, he was really like on a good streak there. He hasn't really been hurt all year since the initial kind of couple of ankle things right when he got back. So that's kind of what I'm watching out for. And then obviously you want to make sure that you're still playing winning basketball. Like you're doing all the little things, your habits are right. Because even if like all the starters are resting, like it is contagious. And last year, what made that team really special is that it didn't matter who was resting, and they had a lot of rest days down the stretch because they had a 14-game lead in the Eastern Conference. But you could still see there was attention to detail when it came to playmaking, when it came to rebounding the ball, taking care of the ball, all those things. They were still doing it at a high level, and they were winning games, and then it translated over into the postseason.
For sure. And like the Jazz in particular tonight, I mean, they're going to try. Like you said, they're going to be competitive. Yeah. Isaiah Collier, Kyle Filipowski, those have been guys that have been getting really valuable game reps the last few weeks. And Jordan Clarkson has come back, and he's in the rotation for them. They're, to me, a lot like the Toronto Raptors. Like they're what I would call fun bad. They lose a lot, but they have a winning record against the spread, which just tells you that they're so much more competitive and talented than like their record says they are. And I know this is not realistic, but like I kind of like to imagine what that team would look like if you just put Donovan Mitchell back on this roster and they were all healthy. Like that would be a pretty good team. Anyway, the other thing I think that you and I specifically have to talk about is Baylor Shireman, because I think that both of us have been advocates for him kind of all year. At least I know I have been. I know I saw you on Twitter kind of singing his praises earlier this week. I liked him a lot coming out of the draft just because I watched him at Creighton a decent amount. I grew up a Providence College fan, so watching him play in the Big East, I got to see him probably a lot more than some other people might have. What do you think his ceiling is as a player?
It's hard. I always believe that people's ceilings are pretty high just because we've seen so many people outperform expectations, but I think he can be a starting level NBA player. Like I think he can be a starting forward on a good team. Like I don't think he's going to ever be a star, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's able to do that because he has really good feel for the game. He, at his best, can score in a variety of ways and can potentially be a really good shooter. And he just does all the little things. He's a good rebounder. He's a great passer. He has great court vision. He knows how to draw charges. He just makes winning plays. And watching him in the G League, I didn't watch too much in college. I don't watch a ton of college basketball, but watching him in the G League, I was super impressed with just like his work ethic, just like how he performed on any given game. And it's hard to consistently play really hard in the G League when a lot of times it's kind of a mess going on. Like, you're not all on the same page, or guys are trying to build up their stats. But he's a first round pick, and he's, living in a hotel in Portland. Like, it's not the most glamorous thing, but he was totally bought into it. And then I think, minus the first couple of weeks where he couldn't make a shot in Boston, he's looked pretty good in his stints in Boston. Like, it's not just this one game where he had the 20-point outing versus, who was that? Who did they just play?
The Nets, Brooklyn.
The Nets, yeah. Minus that game, and then he had the 15-point outing versus 76ers during the homestand. Like, he generally has looked good in his stints, even when he's not shooting. Like, he just knows he's just in the right place at the right time. And The only limitation on him is his athleticism, but we've seen guys be able to overcome their athleticism. So he's not quite the elite shooter that Sam Hauser is, but there's a lot of things that he does that Sam Hauser doesn't do. So at the very least, I think he can become a Sam Hauser level player. Like that's what I would expect from him.
Yeah, and I think I was going to make the exact same comparison because I think people said similar things about Sam Hauser when he came into the league. The criticism of him was just about the athleticism, the defensive end of the floor, and he's worked really hard to prove people wrong in that respect. And I think that Shireman, that's all you want from a guy like him. I think people have a tendency to take it a little too far at times where they're like, oh, like we can trade Pritchard or trade Porzingis because we have Baylor Shireman now. Like that might be going a step too far, but I do think there's something to be said for the fact that he definitely can be a contributor and should be, especially considering that he is a guy who's on one of those rookie contracts. And if they are looking to offload a little bit of salary, they might have him kind of in their back pockets as somebody who can fill in and be a guy who fills a role if need be. Going forward, looking at the home stretch of the season, including tonight, there's 13 games left. As you alluded to, there's only 3 games left against teams that are over 500 as of the recording of this podcast today before any games are played tonight. And that's Sacramento, Memphis, and the Knicks. They've got, I think, 6 straight games on the road. And those are mostly against some of those teams that are really inferior. But what you kind of talked about this a little bit before, but what do you think is more important right now, getting that rest and getting healthy or avoiding getting rusty before the playoffs start?
Yeah, I think they're going to rest guys with rust in mind. So you're not going to all of a sudden rest Tatum for the final 6 games of the regular season. But there's also a back-to-back coming up between the Kings and the Blazers. There's no reason for anybody to play in both of those games, in my opinion. A couple weeks before the playoffs start, you don't need a back-to-back under you. So I think that's like they have a pretty good medical staff. A lot of that comes down to like not even Joe, but it's discussions with players, individual, trainers and medical teams and everything. I think if you're nursing something the way that like Jalen is, I would lean on the side of rest over rhythm. Unless it's the kind of thing that's just not going to get better. Like, I don't know exactly what's wrong with Jalen's knee. But I've had knee things where it's like, you could rest for 3 months. It's not going to help. So I don't know what's wrong with him exactly. It's, being listed as like an impingement in his right knee, like patellar tendon. And sometimes it's listed something a little bit different, but generally speaking, I would say like everybody should play maybe like half of these games. But not too extended of an absence where you're now like losing rhythm. The main thing I would say though is that regardless of who's playing, they need to approach these games as regular games, must-win games, and play the right way and win. Because if they go down the stretch here, they finish the season 5-8, like it might not impact their standing. Like they have a pretty healthy lead over the Knicks for the number 3 seed. But you don't play bad basketball for the final month of the season and then turn it around. You can. And honestly, the Nuggets are an exception to this. The Nuggets kind of did that in the year they won the championship. They kind of tanked the last couple of weeks and lost a bunch of easy games and obviously won the championship. So you can turn it around, but I don't think that's how anybody wants to go into the postseason. So I expect rest to be a priority, but at the same time, and not at the expense of winning, because this team is deep enough to beat, like you said, they're playing mostly sub 500 teams. There's no reason to lose games just because you're resting guys. Sometimes I think they're better when they rest a guy or two, because there's like, it's almost like such a crowded team with talent where you rest one of your starters in a regular season game, not in a series. In a series, I don't want everybody, but in a regular season game, sometimes I feel like it almost kind of gives everybody a few more shot attempts. Everybody plays a little more free, regardless of who it is. Except for Derek White, they're always worse when he sits statistically. So other than that, I think resting a guy here or there should not really impact them too much.
That's fair enough. So right now, the likely playoff opponent in round 1, it's looking like it's probably the Hawks or the Magic in all likelihood. Seeding's kind of more or less set for Cleveland and the Celtics, and then there might be some movement up or down for teams like the Knicks, Pacers, Bucks, Pistons. Those teams might swap here and there. I mentioned this last week on the podcast with Cameron. I'd love to see the Hawks because I'm in Atlanta, so I want to see games in person. But how are you feeling about the path through the East once the playoffs start?
Yeah, the play-in round, it could really be any of those teams. I don't know. It's so hard to predict. Like from a travel standpoint, we're trying to like figure out like our travel, and it would be nice to just know. But yeah, anything could happen there. I keep thinking it's going to be Orlando, just because that would be like, I think that would be the toughest of those teams because they have a really good defense. or at their best they do. After that, I expect New York to beat Detroit, and I'm excited for that series because I think Boston, New York needs a playoff series. Like, it's good for the basketball, it's good for the league. It'll be a moneymaker, but also just fun. Two great basketball environments. Obviously, I feel pretty confident about the Celtics' chances, just considering how the regular season matchups have gone this year. I don't think the Knicks have the same toughness and physicality they had in previous iterations without Isaiah Hartenstein. Even Julius Randle, who I'm not like a huge fan of, but he did bring a certain edge to that team that they don't have anymore. So I feel pretty good about that round. And then obviously you're looking at Cleveland in the conference finals, and it's as sure of a bet as you can have about a conference landing with two teams in the conference finals. Like, this is as sure as I'll ever be. The two teams are going to face off in the conference finals. Obviously the Celtics could lose earlier. The Bucks could maybe upset Cleveland. Anything could happen, but I'm expecting those to be the two teams. And I think that's going to be a great series, 6 or 7 games. And I pick Boston, but it's going to be a great series. And we've seen Cleveland just have an enormous levels of winning. They've lost 3 in a row now, but they've just had some ridiculous streaks this year. And I think people aren't that excited about them because they have a lot of kind of quiet personalities. Even at All-Star Weekend, like the way that it works at All-Star Weekend is you have players kind of stationed in the same room. Reporters can go talk to specific players, and it's like 12 players at a time. And like Evan Mobley and Darius Garland consistently have like nobody talking to them. Like, they just don't have the appeal nationally, but they've been under the radar this year, despite the fact everybody knows that they've won a ton of games.
I've been shocked by the season that they've had. I was saying all season, I was like, oh, the Celtics will get the 1 seed by Christmas. It's fine. Cleveland's going to slide back. And then I was like, nah, maybe they'll get it by the All-Star break. And that didn't happen. So I continue to be amazed by how well they're playing and some of the games that they would win. I mean, there were comeback wins. It was much, honestly, like the Celtics last year, where they would be in a hole in the fourth quarter and somehow find a way, even missing Donovan Mitchell. I think in one particular game, I think it was against the Raptors, they had a huge comeback where they stormed back and won. And it just reminded me of the way the Celtics played at times over the last couple of years, where they would just maybe not take an opponent all that seriously, and then it just come storming back and win in thrilling fashion, which it was pretty cool to see. But do you take the Cavaliers seriously in a series? I know you said it would be 6 or 7 games and you'd take Boston, but I think there's a lot of people that probably don't take them as seriously as they should. Do you take them seriously?
Yeah, I do. I think deep playoff runs are hard to replicate, but we've also seen teams win the first deep playoff run they've had. Like the Golden State Warriors did that, the Nuggets did that. So, I take them seriously, but at the same time, I think I would be surprised if the Celtics lost. Like, I'm pretty confident the Celtics are going to go to the finals. Confident to the sense of like it's basketball and anything can happen, and I'm very aware of that. But from like a prediction standpoint, I feel pretty good about it. I think Oklahoma City I view as a more formidable opponent based on what we saw this year, but also based on the fact that they're literally on track to have the largest margin of victory by any team ever in NBA history. So we'll see, though.
Well, and it's crazy to me that the Celtics, they have a real chance. If they go 10-3 down the stretch, they'll win 60 games and they won't even win the conference. Like, that's amazing to me. But I guess, so the last question I have for you is just, if you take health out of the equation, what do the Celtics need to do to repeat as NBA champions this season?
This is probably a little bit of a cop-out, but they need to shoot well. Like, I think when you look back at that stretch where they, especially versus Oklahoma City, like that team is that might be what you get versus their defense is 3-point shots. And like, you don't hit them, you might be in trouble. And, you look back at last year's team and their success, a lot of it relied on guys shooting well. And in the playoffs, guys shot well as well. Like, not necessarily Tatum didn't have a great shooting playoff run, but a lot of other people did. As a group, they can't all be slumping. Like, they're going to have some guys be on their game. And that's the variance part of winning a championship. Like, there's some luck involved. And I think that's somewhat luck too. Even if you get good looks, you're not always going to hit them. And if you go back to that stretch of time where they were basically playing 500 basketball for like 6 weeks, a lot of it can be attributed to the fact that you had a bunch of guys slumping at the same time. Like that, Sam Hauser was slumping. Derek White was a massive one. Tatum and Brown were both, like, everybody was slumping. And so you just can't have that happen in May. Like, you could get over it in December. And so that's the downside of being a team that relies so heavily on 3-point shooting. Like, Oklahoma City doesn't. Denver doesn't. Cleveland actually does. That's people kind of going under the radar is how much they've had a hot shooting season. But outside of injuries, I think that's the biggest thing that's just a little bit out of your control. I don't think that there's going to be schematic things. I mean, obviously you want to make sure Pritchard can play in the playoffs. There's some questions around that. You haven't really seen him contribute at a super high level in the postseason before, but those things I'm like more certain about. The shooting thing, you just don't know. And there's a couple guys, specifically Drew Holiday and Jaylen Brown that are having kind of career lows in shooting, and whether or not that's going to turn around at any point is kind of TBD.
Yeah, I think I felt this way during a couple of those games recently where they did shoot kind of poorly, and particularly that OKC game. Like I think that the Celtics have the advantage of their players having been there before in the playoffs. Like they are not going to be afraid of that moment. They have got, like, particularly Derek White and Al Horford they've been like 3-point shooting saviors for this team for so long. Like if you go back and watch some of the biggest games this year, it's Derek White and Al Horford hitting threes when the rest of the team can't buy a bucket. And it's honestly, it's great to watch. And it's something that I think they honestly can kind of rely on. And I know they didn't get a lot of as many of their shots to go down in that OKC game as they would have liked, but I really didn't think they took that many bad shots in that game. They just happened to miss a good amount of them. And I don't, I think people get caught up in them shooting 63s in a game or whatever, but that's the way they play. And if it doesn't work, then I guess we can question it. But I really didn't think they played that poorly in that game. But again, I think we covered just about everything that I had on the agenda for today. Was there anything else that you felt like was pressing to hit on for the team today?
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on. This has been awesome. Hopefully we can have you back at some point. We'll have to wait a little while for the Celtics game tonight, which doesn't start until 9:30, like we said, out in Utah. So some late games coming up on the road trip, but hopefully we get to see a win tonight. So thanks to everybody out there for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.
Ends tonight here. It's over. Time to say it again, Boston. Anything's possible. Banner number 18 has been secured. The Celtics are NBA champions.